Welcome. I'm Lori Lee Benstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. It's hard to believe that it's been nearly 20 years since 9/11 happened in New York City. I still remember what I was doing the moment the second plane hit the Twin Towers. I was in French class in my junior year of high school, and an announcement was made over the loudspeaker that a plane had hit the Twin Towers. At that point, no one mentioned it was a terrorist attack. No one knew the gravity of what had happened, and my classmates wanted to turn on the TV. And I just, specifically, my French teacher was just, everybody quiet down. And one of the students was like, no, we need to turn on the TV. And he turned on the TV. And as he turned on the TV, the second plane hit. And we saw it in real time, and everyone just gasped. I was all the way in Jacksonville. These traumatic events become imprinted in our minds. Some choose to forget, especially if it directly affects them. But if an event can affect someone who's 1,000 miles away and just be ingrained in that person's mind, what can that do to someone who is directly affected? And what about the people who grow to love them, the ones who experience secondary trauma? Joining me today is Payton Lynch, author of the recently released book, Rise from the Ashes, Stories of Trauma, Resilience, and Growth from the Children of 9/11. Payton, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Laura Lee. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Your book, Rise from the Ashes, is a compilation of stories of the children of 9/11 victims. What inspired you to write it?
Sure. And so just listening to you share your story of where you were at 9/11, I have those same moments of my own of where I was. And so, of course, as an American, 9/11 has a certain heaviness and a weight to it. Yeah. But it wasn't until I met my now husband that I understood the personal impact it could have when you narrow down, 3,000 lives, which sounds so enormous, to one singular life who touched other people and, including my husband. And so, my husband and I, we've been married almost 6 years, and about 9 years ago or so, when we just started dating, it was summer lovin'. And that September rolled around. It was our first September together. And I did not know that this was a part of his story. We're from Pennsylvania. And so even being that close to New York City, I really didn't know anyone else who was personally impacted. Mm-hmm. And so he took me out to dinner that night at a Bonefish Grill. And I just thought it was another normal night, another date night. And he started to open up at the dinner table about his story. And he shared that his father, Robert Henry Lynch Jr., was a property manager of Two World Trade and was there on the day of 9/11. He actually was outside of the building and called home. And in fact, it's still on tape to this day, and 2001 technology. So it's on like a giant, recorder cassette. But he said that he was safe, that things were crazy, but he would call them as soon as he could, and that he loved them. And I always think, are they, what goes through my family's mind of, do they wish they had picked up? Are they grateful to have the call? Like, you don't win, right? Because at the end of the day, you don't have your dad anymore, because he did not call back, unfortunately, because he went back into the building and he did save people's lives that day. He was found escorting people out, and he was recognized with a Medal of Valor presented to him, presented to his family at the White House in the years to follow. And it's an incredible honor, and he was a civilian. It was not a part of his call of duty to be there and help others, but yet there are specific people who have been able to go to my husband and his siblings and his stepmother and say, you know, your dad saved my life, or your dad saved this person's life. And I was so glad that the restaurant was very dimly lit, because I was really struggling to keep it together. I think what amazed me the most was this was someone I love. And I am biased, but I think he's the most caring, generous, kind person I've ever met. And all I could think was, if this were me, I don't know that I would be the way he is. If this were my life and my story, I think I would be angry. I mean, I just think, how could you not? You lost your parent in a national tragedy. And so that always lay dormant for me, right? That like, no matter what, my husband has found a way to keep going and be resilient and find the joy in his life. And it didn't really resonate until this past year. I think, 2020 brought all of its joyous challenges with the pandemic.
Right.
He was laid off. We were both Walt Disney World cast members, and he was laid off because of the pandemic. I went to full-time working from home. And we were also in the midst of, and continue to be in the midst of, a battle with infertility. And for me personally, this has been my first biggest life challenge. I'm very fortunate that I didn't have a childhood impact of that, certainly of that magnitude, right? And yet I started to recognize that there's something about my husband, because of what happened to him, that has better equipped him for what we're going through now. And at first I used to be so mad. I was like, John, just be mad with me. Just tell me it sucks, because it does suck. I mean, infertility is not fun. And it's not that he's not upset, but he's like, honey, I've already been through hell. We can get through this. He can see the arc, that there is another side to it. And I was like, all right, I need this for myself. I need to learn what it is, what that difference is. How do we build resilience? And I started reaching out to other folks in the 9/11 community, specifically folks who lost parents, to see what their journeys were. And I knew that the conversations would be impactful. I just never imagined the impact they would have on me, and that it would turn into this project that's now a book about what they were all able to do, but also to show others what they are able to do with their own circumstances. So it has been a journey, and I can't wait for folks to be able to sink their teeth into the book and see all the insights that they have to share.
Oh my goodness. I started getting really emotional there, because when I think about what I felt, like I put myself in your shoes with your husband telling you exactly what happened, because just that story alone, that his father called and said, everything's okay. I feel like that would be devastating for me at the end of the day. Be like, okay, don't, dad's okay. And then you find out differently, but it must have been truly inspiring for him that his father did so much in those last moments.
We just did he just did an interview the other day, and besides for this book and the casual conversations we've had as a married couple, I never until the other day had an opportunity to hear him speak publicly about this. And the person asked him if he was ever angry or upset that his dad went back inside. And he said, of course, I would love to have my dad back, but that's not who my dad was. And there are people who are alive who had something left that they needed to do, that are alive because of my dad. And I was sitting outside of this office door on the floor, because I wanted to hear the interview. And I had to cover my mouth, because I was like, this interview is going to hear some crazy woman sobbing outside. But to have that perspective, and it is truly that is the core of who he is. That is the core of what he believes, that truth. It's not for show. And I was like, that to me is an incredible example of the arc of his journey. Because I know that wasn't always his feeling on the matter, understandably. So,
oh, wow. Yes, that's very impactful and inspiring. Excuse me. Did your husband struggle with PTSD from that event? And if he did he realize it was PTSD from this event?
I think it did take a lot of uncovering, and we're still uncovering now. In fact, we're in therapy for fertility, but you never just go in and just talk about whatever that one topic is. And these things start to come out and they emerge of like what your inner child was sort of holding on to. And what we have been discovering and walking through was that there were some pretty painful things that were said to him in the years following 9/11, because 9/11 itself was traumatic, right? He watched it on TV in school. He was the only kid in his classroom or in his whole school who lost a parent that day. And so, that actual time was so traumatic. But then it's like you had the support of so many friends and family during that time. And then it was like 2 to 3 years later, everyone sort of fell off, right? Because the rest of the United States sort of started to move on. But he had a guidance counselor actually tell him that for like months after 9/11, that his dad could still be alive in an air pocket. He had people tell him that, oh, well, some people, they could have just picked up and started new lives because, they're missing and no body was recovered, right? So you're left with this questioning of, would my dad ever do that? Like, what a horrible thing to tell a child.
Wow.
Plus the conspiracy theories around 9/11. I mean, it is not a private event at all. And the biggest thing that he continues to carry with him, I would say there's two things. The first would be he does have dreams about the buildings, and they are not of the burning buildings. And we've done a lot to remove ourselves from social media and places where we're going to see that during September to avoid some of that. But he has very vivid memories of walking through the buildings. He could tell you what the color of the carpet was and how squishy it was. And so that continues to sort of play on loop. Every once in a while, it will reemerge. And then the second thing is that he still holds on to. He was 13 at the time. He had an older sister in college and then 3 younger siblings. All of which don't remember their dad because they were 5 and younger. And he went to camp either that summer or a few summers after for kids who lost a parent in 9/11. And there was an activity where you tied a note to like a rock or a piece of wood or something and would send it out onto a lake. And you're sending the letters to heaven, essentially. And he wrote in that letter to his dad that he would take care of his brothers and that he would, act as the dad figure. And he feels that he didn't hold up that end of the bargain. So he'll often say, like, I'm not proud of myself because I didn't do what I said I was going to do. Whereas no one expected the 13-year-old to fill the fatherly figure. And if you talk to any of his brothers, I mean, especially one of his brothers down here now, they love Disney. They're together all the time. They share so many hobbies. They adore him. And so it's just such a dichotomy from what is actually what his family feels about him. And it breaks my heart because no matter how much we tell him, he has to believe that. And that is something that, telling your inner child, like, I am proud of you. I struggle with that. It is weird. I'm like, this feels awkward. But it's important work for us to retrain our brains. It's amazing how impactful our own thoughts can be.
Yeah, I did a lot of inner child work and it is really helpful. I do remember before actually doing it being like, this was weird, little
Yeah.
Lori Lee. But when you really felt it and you really turned yourself inward, you're healing this part of you that you've carried for so long.
Right.
I'm still doing that in different little ages that I experience certain traumas. I continuously try to heal that age. For you as a wife, as someone who's experienced such an immense trauma, has his trauma affected you?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not something I thought was possible until I had a conversation with a psychologist for this book, or a therapist. Her name is Stacy Boyer. And she actually worked with folks who were involved in the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school shooting in Parkland, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And she shared a story with me about how there was a child who actually heard another student retell their experience of being in the building that day. And this child wasn't even in the building. And she started developing PTSD. And I said, oh my goodness, this is real. Like, I thought that I was always afraid of accepting that. I think that this could be happening to me, because I would always say, well, this can't be, because this is John's thing. This is what happened to my husband, and his trauma is so much worse. So, like, we can't worry about me and my, me having an issue with it. But in reality, it's been very painful to hear these stories. And I've had to avoid 9/11 related content, because I see it through such a different lens now. It's not just a rubbernecking experience on the highway where I got to turn and look. Like, I know that I lost my father-in-law, the grandfather to my future children, like, won't know him. Like, there are implications now. There's so many ripples from that one day that impact me so personally. And it's a really delicate tightrope to walk in general, because on one side, I do have that, this is an American experience that I understand and appreciate, versus I'm a wife, and this is very personal for me. So there's even times when we do go to the memorial and things like that, I feel like I'm having a bit of an out of body experience, while I need to be present with my husband, who's in the resting place of his father. But yet you're standing around and you're seeing people like take selfies and pictures, and understanding that they're here at a monument to learn something. It's a very weird place for me to sit. And I'm not sure I'm still very comfy in this space, but I'm learning to take my time with it. Even after the interviews, I'm like, you know what? I've just got to sit for a minute and feel what I have to feel, and be thoughtful about what information I bring back to my husband too, because I don't want to re-trigger anything for him after sharing these interviews with him.
Wow. Last year, I remember I interviewed one of the surviving children of 9/11, Matthew Bocci, and I posted on social media, kind of trying to promote the episode that was coming out. And I did get some people who did lose somebody, and they were like, this was very triggering. And I felt really bad because, obviously, like you were saying, we look at it through a different lens. It's like we all shared in this grief, but everyone's perspective is so different.
Right.
That was very eye-opening for me. Do you feel like do you have any suggestions for people who are trying to memorialize or honor people through social media, or just the event itself, and how we can avoid triggering?
Yeah. You're right. It is different for everyone. There are certain things that trigger certain folks that don't trigger others. I know from our personal experience, pictures of burning buildings, it's just not a good,
Don't do
good
it.
look. Don't do it in general with traumatic events or things of that nature. And I think through it, of my lens of infertility, right? It is so hard for me to see pregnancy announcements right now. I can do as much as I can to filter out, but at the end of the day, I'm still going to see them. I still have pregnant friends. I'm not going to ignore them all. But I think the ones that have resonated the most are those people who celebrate their joy or celebrate whatever it is they're posting, but then also say, hey, for those who are seeing this, who are having this type of experience, I see you, I care, please reach out if this is something that we need to talk about or that you're finding offensive. I'm not perfect. I'm trying to learn. And I think that's the lens I've taken with this book as well, because I've had my stepmother-in-law like heavily read through the whole thing, because I don't want a foot in mouth experience where I say something insensitive without me even knowing. But to your point, we sometimes don't know, and we're all human. And I think for the most part, everyone wants to give everybody a little bit of grace that they might not know, and use that as an opportunity to educate or be open to being educated about something if we do cross those lines.
Yeah, I mean, even as a sexual abuse survivor, I do recall talking to a sexual assault survivor and still saying the wrong things.
Right.
And I appreciated her saying, why is this question important? Because I find it to be triggering. And I was like, wow, I didn't even realize that. And so it's very sensitive when you're talking about these topics of grief and abuse. And so it is difficult, but I do appreciate you sharing your thoughts there, because I think that could absolutely be helpful for others. You do talk about your infertility and how over the last year has been extremely difficult, and you are writing this book. I mean, how did you do it all?
How do you ever do it all, right? I don't think anyone ever does it all. There's certainly things I've had to sacrifice. And I think what's great is I have a really great publishing team who helps me stick to those deadlines. And it certainly helps it to be able to say, sorry, I can't, I have a deadline, right? I mean, it's not like I'm trying to get out of anything. I really have this deadline. And I'm a very deadline driven person, so that has worked for me, but it is really challenging. I'm working full time as well. So wow. And my fertility clinic is an hour away. The way I've been trying to see it, and it's truly from a lot of these lessons. So it's sort of like, I needed to write this book at this period of my life, because I don't think I would be able to get through it without what I've learned. And one of the biggest insights I've heard from 9/11 surviving children is gratitude. And at first I was like, come on, like, I'm not just going to wake up and be happy every day, whatever. Like, this is hard stuff. And what I found is it's actually more of a practice. And for me, it's spending time each morning thinking about at least 3 things that I'm grateful for. Even if it's like, if I can't think of anything, it's like, okay, I heard a bird chirping, there's always something. And it's not that I ignore the bad things. And I think actually embracing what I'm grateful for has allowed me to also accept what I'm sad about and process that and then let go of it when it's time. But I'm like, you know what? I don't get to drive anymore. I work from home. I've got an hour commute and then an hour on the way back where I get to be by myself and just think about, everything that I do have in my life. And, all the things that are to come that, the universe is going to send my way. I set aside that dedicated writing time. I think that's been the biggest thing for me, is making sure in the mornings that I have that time to write. And everybody in this house knows, like, these are my writing hours. Do not bother me. I'm in my cozy writing corner. And I think whenever we go through challenging times, it's helpful to remember the purpose in the pain or in the challenge. And so I know, like, I have to press through writing this book because it's going to help so many people. I have to press through IUI, IVF, all the things, because the end result is to get a child, and it's going to be so worth it when we get there. So keeping those end goals in mind have definitely helped me a lot.
What were his thoughts of you starting this book? Your husband's thoughts,
yeah.
Excuse me, and sharing his story.
It's funny. It was actually at like 3 a.m, right after the 19th anniversary of 9/11, where I woke up and I was like, I think I have to write this. And I woke him up. I'm like, honey, I think I need to write a book about 9/11. He's like, yeah, okay, go to sleep, and the next morning I'm like, no, I really think I should write this book, but I need your blessing, right? I really need your whole family's blessing because I'm going to be exposing your story, right, for all the world to hear. And he said, jokingly, he's like, well, I'm not going to write it. So if anyone's going to, it should be you. And I think he recognizes too that because I do sort of sit on that tightrope, I'm able to see a bit more holistically than someone who's lived in it can see, to look for those themes and those patterns. And, I messaged his whole family about it as well. And they were, so gracious and welcoming. I include more specifically in the book my husband's story and his youngest brother. So I was really thrilled that one of them wanted to be interviewed because I didn't want to ask them. I had already felt like I asked so much to write the book. So for them to then say, hey, I'd love to chat, to be included more specifically in the book, it just really touched my heart. And, I think they know my heart for the story. I might not get it right all the time, but I'm trying. And, I think that definitely goes a long way.
It takes a lot of courage for someone to want to share their story, especially on a big platform, like a book. For me, sharing my story through this podcast and my magazine, and giving other people a platform to tell their story was really therapeutic for me. It really helped me in my journey, in my recovery. What did you discover about yourself in writing this book?
I think what I learned the most is how much time it takes to walk through grief, and that grief is not a straight line. I am so quick to just, stuff it down and say like, I need to be positive. I find myself smiling even when I tell people bad stuff that's happening to me. And so I'm like, I don't think anyone takes me serious. And then they're like, oh, well, you're just so positive. You're just so happy. I hear that so frequently. So that I was starting to put myself in that positivity box. And really that was just making me angrier when I wasn't at work or whatever, because you can't be one-dimensional like that. And what I saw is, these people went through this over the past 20 years. Of course, they have more space around their grief, right? They've grown over 20 years around their grief. I am still in the middle of it. I cannot expect that same space and growth from myself. They certainly didn't have that, for themselves 1 to 5 years after. And I would have loved, I think, at the end to have had like a BuzzFeed type article, like 5 ways to heal your trauma. But it's not that easy, right? And recognizing for myself that it's going to take time, and that is okay. And some days I will feel fine. And then another day something might happen and I won't feel fine. And that doesn't mean that I'm going backwards. It just means that it's sort of like a spiral staircase. We're just going to keep spinning around, and it'll never go away. But like I said, you grow around it. And so learning that patience and grace for myself, and trust me, I'm not perfect at it, but I feel that it's grown exponentially over the course of these interviews.
Something my husband told me when I was in treatment, because even though everyone told me that, recovery is not a straight line, I guess I was just naive. And when I would have a bad day, I'm like, oh my gosh, I failed. Right. And my husband said to me, you lived with this grief for 20 something years. It's not going to go away in 3 days. In recognizing that, I felt like the pressure was off, because I think there was so much pressure for me to be okay again.
We all like to check a box, right? Oh, done. I checked that off the list. That task is complete. That's not really how grief works. And, I totally resonate with the failure piece there too, because I think that was at the center of a lot and continues to be at the center of a lot of my challenges with infertility is that it does feel like a failure every single month. Like, my cycle starting, it's like a big fat F on the report card, which goes back to the inner child of why do I have to, first of all, why do I have to have an A all the time? Who am I trying to impress? And why am I judging my worth on my ability to get pregnant or my ability to perform or produce?
Right.
It's always worked for me, right? I did get good grades. I like to think I've got a good job and I work hard. And so all those things have been sort of counterintuitive in the pregnancy process, that have really made me stop and say, that is not what my worth is. I'm loved just because I exist, not because I did anything at all. We're human beings, not human doings. And that's something I have to remind myself of constantly.
I mean, that's incredible. Thinking about what you're grateful for, like you're talking about the gratitude, doing that daily is everything. It's hard, but I'm so inspired by you and I support you. And I think it's amazing what you're doing for so many people who have dealt with grief. And I know that you've interviewed, how many stories are in your book?
We've got about 15 or so stories in the book. Some of are which from family units, so multiple children in the family. And interestingly enough, and it's interesting because I want to be very careful about how I went about the interviews. Every story in the book are from people who lost fathers. And the ratio actually for victims of 9/11 was 3-1 of men versus women. So that I have spoken and started speaking to folks who lost mothers, but I think hearing from people who lost fathers tells such an interesting story about the women they left behind, the mothers who were left to pick up the pieces. And the most resilient 9/11 surviving children I've spoken to are resilient because they had incredible mothers who were truly the hidden heroes and kept everything together. It's amazing when I think about the things that my stepmother-in-law and mother-in-law did, and to hear that reflected and appreciated in the children of others. Because, you have kids, you're like, will they ever appreciate me? They're like acting, whatever. And I just hope that they get to read these stories and see, it wasn't all for naught. Their hard work was well done and made a big difference in these now adults' lives.
Wow. I bet it was amazing to see that, like see how these stories evolved. And I think that's amazing that it was these mothers, because you don't really think about that. The mothers who had to pick up the pieces,
right,
who had to rebuild the family and support them as both, a mother and a father and someone who's also grieving as well.
Right. I mean, they were going through their own stuff, and a lot of them had to suppress, or however they got through it. I don't know. I mean, it's amazing, but we know there is research there to show keeping people in their routines or getting them back to their routines does help with the recovery process. And so for them to recognize, I have to do this for my child. But again, I think there is that purpose piece there, right? Knowing I have to do this for my child helped them also to recover. So it's this sort of symbiotic relationship, I think, between parent, mother and child that really helped them through the past 20 years.
Was there a story that stood out to you?
So many. I will share one from, her name is Nicole Foster, and she was 5 at the time of 9/11. Her dad did work at Cantor Fitzgerald, which I believe is the same place that Matt Bocci's father worked at. And so young at the time, very limited memories of her her father. But then actually, you think you've had enough, you think you've already been through the toughest thing in your life. And then at 15, it was actually her 15th birthday, she was diagnosed with leukemia. Mm. So I just, talking to her, I'm like, come on, like how many things could happen to this person, right? I asked her, I'm like, were you ever mad, that this happened? And she's like, I didn't have time to be mad. I only had enough energy to focus on the here and now and what I was going to do to get through the next day and the next day and the next day as they came. And so, she just, I can't imagine being 15, laying in a hospital bed. And said that she would just tell herself, my dad is watching over me. My dad is here for me. He's making things align so that I have the right doctors and the right support to get through this. I trust that these doctors will get me through this. And I think what she didn't realize then was that this whole mind, body, spirit approach, having that wheel, right, of all these different connections can really be impactful in recovery. And I think what's so amazing now, I mean, she's recovered from cancer, thank goodness. And she now she works for the Calm app. So she does, help people through their own challenges. And she's like a holistic health coach, as well as she's seen just how the benefits of that type of thinking, taking care of your body, nutrition, all of that has played out in her own life. And, I think that's just a perfect example of how I've seen many 9/11 surviving children go into service industries and service type roles, because there is that empathy piece there that they want to give back. They've lived through it themselves. And so they want to help others through it. And so I think of her all the time, because I just think she's just such a strong person. And I can't wait to see what else she does, right? Because, only 5 at the time, she's like around 25, 26 now. There's so much opportunity left for her. I feel like this book needs like a sequel in another 20 years.
You're right. There you go. I think with a lot of people who've dealt with grief and trauma, what's helped, me and I interview trauma survivors all the time. Mm-hmm. And I think it's finding that purpose to help others. And, and this is your purpose. And I mean, it sets you on fire. It's what kind of helps you move through your days when your days are not that great, because we all have those days.
Yeah. And I think they'd all rather have their parents back, right? I would much rather have a baby than have to tell this story. But, you're totally right. The amount of people I have heard from once I started opening up about our infertility journey, oh my goodness, like so empowering to hear from people who are like, me too. Mm-hmm. When at first I thought I was so alone, like people don't talk about this. And to hear them say, thank you for showing this, because it's given me a space to feel like I can talk about this and be more honest about it, and just know that there's other people out there. And so I think there's so much power in sharing our stories. And you just never know where you're going to meet that next person and where they're at in their portion of their journey, and how you're going to come in and influence them and help them.
Yeah. What is your hope in writing this book?
My hope is that we can walk away from this and see the opportunity for greater empathy in our lives. I think, 9/11 is the big draw, right? Everybody wants to know about 9/11. And so it's I don't want to say exciting topic, because it's not that, but it draws people's interest for sure. Mm-hmm. But it's the deeper connecting stories within that connect us all, right? Maybe you didn't lose a parent in 9/11, but you probably dealt with something crappy in your life before. And so if we're able to become more empathetic through hearing other stories, which I think understanding and trying to walk in other shoes is a big piece of empathy. But to take it a step beyond that, my biggest call to action is how might we get better, or at least any empathy training in our schools as well as in our workplace? Because there are just too many times where I have heard of disastrous things from, no return to work plans for people who go through a traumatic event, or, not feeling that you can bring your authentic self to work and sharing what's going on. Oh my goodness, I can't imagine if I couldn't tell my boss about all my appointments that I have and like what I'm going through, or if I couldn't turn my camera off at work. I mean, that would just be devastating. And I know that's a reality for a lot of people who don't feel open to speak. And so I hope that, this book is just the jumping off point, the catalyst to something larger where we might be able to really get people the training that's needed, because 9/11 surviving children, they are an amazing group of people, but they're not superheroes. And the skills and traits that they've learned to get through their grief are accessible for all of us. If we just take the time to practice these things.
Yeah. A portion of the proceeds will go to Tuesday's Children. Could you tell me about Tuesday's Children and why you chose to give some of the proceeds to this organization?
Absolutely. And I'm so happy to share that in the pre-sale campaign, we were actually able to donate $4,000 to Tuesday's Children, which was just incredible. But Tuesday's Children, they have been a huge proponent in my husband and his family's lives since 9/11. They originally were started as an organization to support the families of the victims of 9/11, and have turned into something much bigger than that, where it used to be, how do we get the support for wives, whether that's through certain groups or camps and access to things of that nature. That's really where it started. And now they're so involved in job training, helping students or the children of 9/11 find internships, meeting them at their stage of life where they're at now, and then expanding now to support other folks who are impacted by war violence, mass shootings, things of that nature. Mm-hmm. So they've come a long way as an organization. And I just know that a lot of my husband's development and ability to recover has come from the team over there. So when I first started to write the book, I reached out to my stepmother-in-law and said, where do I even start with this? Like, do you know people that would even be interested in sharing? How do I breach this conversation? And she said, talk to Tuesday's Children. And once they heard my story and what I was trying to share, they put out a giant newsletter to all of the folks who they've supported in the past, asking them if they would be interested in sharing for the book. And so most of the folks who I interviewed because of the connection through Tuesday's Children. So they have been immensely invested and helpful through this entire process. And I know, unfortunately, there will be new families that they will have to support, because I'd be naive to say that, these sort of things will not continue to happen. But to know that they are there to do that, and that we could just be a little piece of that, I'm really grateful for it.
Wow. Well, we're all grateful for you and, your husband sharing his story. And I think this is amazing. What will you guys be doing for the 20th anniversary of 9/11?
We're still undecided, and I'm very careful to push the subject because I want to be respectful of that. It's a big one. I think we're all sort of feeling that. And I think that's where the hesitancy comes from, of what to plan. But I know in past years, my husband just loves to do something fun. I mean, he knows that that's the best way to honor his dad. His dad was a ton of fun. And if there's a way for us to be either together with the family or, do a FaceTime call with the family, that's a good way to do it. I can tell you what we won't be doing, and it's being on social media or connected to our phones, because even the texts that come in that day, as appreciated as they are, it's overwhelming, I think, for him to receive all of that feedback at one time.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we just step away. We do something fun in his memory, and spend it with family where we can. So most likely looking forward to that this year as well.
Beautiful. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think if there's anyone out here who is going through a challenging time, I would just want to tell them, keep going. And I know that is such a hard thing to hear when you're in the middle of a challenging time, but we have to sort of walk through the fire sometimes to come out through the other side. And the most beautiful things come out of the fire when they do, right? Phoenixes rise from ashes. And I think we'd all agree we could do without the fire, but it's sometimes a necessary part of the process. And you will be so much stronger and better for it. So just keep going. You are very much seen, loved, and cared for and wanted. And so, just keep on walking one foot in front of the other.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so grateful.
Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation and appreciate your time.
That was Payton Lynch, author of Rise from the Ashes, Stories of Trauma, Resilience, and Growth from the Children of 9/11. To learn more about Payton, please visit my website at tstpodcast.com. That's letter A, tstpodcast.com. There you can find the link to purchase her book. You can also find my social media platforms at the top of my homepage, and don't forget to subscribe to my email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. Thank you so much for listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. I'm Lori Lee Binstock. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. Take care.